digital scan of the Titanic has offered an unprecedented insight into the ship's final moments.
The ship that was never supposed to sink, it was meant to be the triumph of an age. A ship so vast, so technologically advanced, that it would forever redefine the limits of human ambition. In 1912, the RMS Titanic was more than an ocean liner, it was a symbol, a statement that mankind had conquered the sea itself. At nearly 270 meters long and 53 meters high, the Titanic was the largest moving object ever built. Her hull was a cathedral of steel, her engines the most powerful ever installed in a passenger vessel. She carried Turkish baths, electric elevators, and dining rooms modeled after Versailles. Newspapers called her unsinkable. Her builders called her the Ship of Dreams. When she departed Southampton on April 10, 1912, bound for New York, the Titanic carried 218 souls. Millionaires, migrants, engineers, and families seeking new lives across the Atlantic. Among them were names that would echo through history: John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in America; Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining empire; and hundreds of immigrants traveling in steerage, carrying little more than hope. The air that day was filled with pride and faith in progress. The Industrial Revolution had changed everything: steam, electricity, engineering, and Titanic was its crown jewel. No one could imagine what was coming. The night of the collision, 4 days into the voyage, the sea was calm, too calm. Survivors would later say it was like glass, perfectly still beneath a moonless sky. At 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, a lookout in the crow's nest shouted the words that would echo through time: "Iceberg, right ahead." First Officer Murdoch ordered the engines reversed and the ship turned hard to port. Titanic began to swing, but her immense mass resisted. 37 seconds later, the iceberg scraped along her starboard side. To those on deck, it felt like a soft vibration, but below the waterline, the impact was catastrophic. For decades, the public imagined that the iceberg had torn a single, enormous gash down the ship's side, a fatal wound through steel. The reality was subtler and far more lethal. The iceberg's jagged base had struck 6 separate sections of the hull, popping out rivets and opening small slits between steel plates. Each puncture was no larger than a hand, but together they broke the ship's watertight integrity across 6 compartments. Titanic was designed to stay afloat with 4 flooded compartments, not 6. Within minutes, freezing seawater poured through the breaches. The ship began to tilt forward almost imperceptibly. Passengers felt the shift, but didn't understand it. In the boiler rooms, engineers heard the sound first: water roaring through broken seams, metal groaning under pressure. By midnight, the damage was irreversible. The descent into chaos. Captain Edward Smith, a veteran of the White Star Line, ordered the distress call sent out. The message flashed in Morse code: CQD, CQD sauce, come quick. At first, few believed the ship was in danger. Passengers in first class were told to put on life jackets as a precaution. Some even laughed. The Titanic's band played cheerful music in the first-class lounge to calm nerves. But by 12:30 a.m., the bow had dipped noticeably lower. Water now covered the name Titanic on the hull. The order came: women and children to the lifeboats. But there were only enough for about half of those on board. Many boats were launched half empty. Some passengers refused to leave the unsinkable ship, clinging to the illusion of safety. Others were trapped below decks as crew sealed watertight doors to slow the flooding. By 1:40 a.m., the ship's fate was sealed. The water had filled the first 5 compartments and was spilling over into the 6th. The bow was now submerged, the stern rising high above the waves. The sound of collapsing bulkheads echoed through the ship like thunder. At 20:18 a.m., witnesses in the lifeboats saw the Titanic break apart. The stern rose nearly vertical before tearing away from the bow. Both sections sank separately, the bow plunging first, the stern following minutes later. Then, silence. Only the sound of freezing water and distant cries. Of the 218 people on board, more than 500 perished. Many froze to death within minutes in the near-freezing Atlantic. Only 705 survived, pulled from lifeboats hours later by the Carpathia. The world awoke to a new reality. The myth and the memory in the aftermath, Titanic became more than a disaster. It became a symbol of hubris. The unsinkable dream of progress had been torn open by nature's indifference. For decades, her wreck remained undiscovered. Some believed it lay intact on the seabed, others thought she had disintegrated completely. Expeditions searched the North Atlantic with sonar and cameras, but the ocean kept its secret. Then, in 1985, after 73 years, Dr. Robert Ballard and his team found her. At a depth of nearly 12,500 feet, resting in the pitch black cold, the Titanic emerged from the shadows of their sonar screens. The discovery was one of the greatest achievements in maritime archaeology. When the first images appeared, the ship's bow still proud, the railings covered in rust, a single boiler lying exposed, the world was stunned. After decades of myth, there she was, lying in eternal silence. But the truth was more complicated. The ship was not whole. She was broken into two vast sections, the bow resting upright, the stern mangled and twisted more than 600 meters away. Between them lay a field of debris, dishes, shoes, furniture, letters, the remnants of human life. It was a graveyard, but also a time capsule. The ocean's darkness had preserved the moment of tragedy in chilling detail. Ballard's discovery reignited the world's obsession with Titanic. Expeditions multiplied through the 1980s and 1990s. Each mission revealed new details. The ornate tilework, the chandeliers, the grand staircase reduced to splinters, but still magnificent. Yet for all the photographs, videos, and recovered artifacts, one question lingered. What really happened that night? Every theory, every textbook, every documentary had been built on partial truth, limited by what divers could see and what the ocean allowed them to reach. Most of the ship was still hidden in darkness, covered in silt and bacteria, unreachable even to the most advanced submersibles. It was like trying to understand a cathedral by looking through a keyhole. That limitation led to a new kind of mission, one that would use cutting-edge technology to see the Titanic not as fragments, but as a whole. A century after her sinking, the world would finally witness her true shape, every inch mapped, every rivet captured. A digital resurrection of the ship that had defined both human achievement and human tragedy. The year was 2022. Far out in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, beneath waves that had hidden the wreck for over 100 years, a team of engineers, filmmakers, and oceanographers began the most ambitious deep-sea project ever attempted. Their goal was simple but impossible in its scope: to scan the Titanic, every surface, every shadow, every fragment, and rebuild her as a complete three-dimensional model. It would not only preserve her forever, but reveal truths that had been hidden since that terrible night. The ship that was never supposed to sink was about to speak again. This time, not through survivors or stories, but through data. And what the scan would uncover would shatter everything we thought we knew. The mission to scan the Titanic for more than a century, the wreck of the RMS Titanic lay in the darkness, unreachable, mysterious, and slowly vanishing. Divers had photographed fragments, submersibles had filmed narrow corridors, but no one had ever seen the ship as a whole. That changed in 2022. In a mission that combined art, engineering, and reverence, two groups joined forces: Atlantic Productions, renowned for creating world-class historical documentaries, and Magellan, a pioneer in deep-sea mapping. Their shared goal was not recovery or treasure, it was preservation. To capture Titanic completely, as she now lies, before time and nature erase her forever. The plan was as ambitious as the ship herself: to produce the first full-scale, photorealistic 3D scan of the Titanic, mapping every inch of her wreck site across the North Atlantic seabed. For the first time, humanity would be able to explore her without diving a single meter below the surface. The challenge beneath 12,500 feet at nearly 12,500 feet deep. The Titanic rests in perpetual night. The temperature hovers just above freezing, and the water pressure crushes everything with relentless force. Over 6,000 pounds per square inch, the equivalent of nearly 400 elephants standing on every square inch of steel. It is a world where nothing human can survive, Even the strongest submersibles are strained to their limits. Down there, metal bends, electronics corrode, and the simplest mistake can end a mission before it begins. Yet that is where the teams chose to go. The expedition began aboard specialized research vessels equipped with remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, robotic explorers tethered to the ship above by long fiber optic cables. These ROVs acted as both cameras and eyes, capable of flying just meters above the wreck in total darkness. Each one carried high-resolution lenses, laser scanners, and powerful LED lights that could pierce the gloom like twin suns. It was a dangerous ballet of precision. One wrong movement could slam a propeller into a century-old railing or shatter a camera against the rusting hull. To make the mission possible, the engineers developed a grid-based flight plan that allowed the robots to sweep the wreck in careful, overlapping passes. The Titanic's bow and stern, separated by nearly 800 meters of debris, would each be scanned from dozens of angles. Every bolt, beam, and broken plate mattered. Every image would form part of a monumental puzzle. 700,000 photographs and a digital resurrection over the course of 200 hours of dives. The ROVs worked methodically, moving back and forth like underwater drones mapping an alien world. They captured more than 700,000 overlapping photographs, each one perfectly aligned to stitch together later into a seamless model. The process used a method known as photogrammetry, a technique that merges countless two-dimensional images into a single, three-dimensional representation. It is the same approach used to map planets, reconstruct ancient ruins, and visualize entire cities. But no one had ever attempted it on a site this large or this deep. Each image contained millions of data points: depth, angle, light reflection, position relative to the grid. When processed together, they produced something extraordinary, a digital twin of the Titanic, accurate to within a few millimeters. For the first time since 1912, the ship existed whole again, not in the ocean, but in data. In this virtual space, researchers could zoom in close enough to read serial numbers on boilers, inspect the decay patterns on railings, or trace the cracks where the hull had torn open. They could fly through cabins, walk the deck, and see the once grand staircase where passengers had danced just days before disaster. It was like raising the Titanic, not from the sea, but from history itself, revealing what eyes could never see. Earlier manned dives had always faced the same obstacles: limited visibility, short battery life, and human risk. Divers could only explore a fraction of the ship at a time, and every movement stirred up clouds of silt that concealed more than they revealed. Now, for the first time, there were no such limits. The robots could linger for hours, hovering in stillness, studying details too delicate for any diver to approach. They examined the stern, twisted and shattered by the ship's final descent. They captured the bow, still majestic even in ruin, its anchors resting like sentinels in the sediment. They traced the trail of debris between them: plates, boots, letters, suitcases, fragments of life scattered across the seafloor. Each photograph became a record of memory, every rivet a witness, every shard of metal a voice from 1912. When the images were transmitted to servers on land, they formed an ocean of information, several terabytes of data, one of the largest deep-sea imaging collections ever created. Processing it took months. Supercomputers aligned each frame, correcting for distortion, refraction, and movement. Slowly, the ship began to take shape. The final render was breathtaking. There she was, the Titanic, suspended in digital space, perfectly still, perfectly preserved. The model was so detailed that even the smallest rust formations, known as rusticles, were visible, hanging like coral from her beams. The hull's texture was mapped down to the exact curvature of the steel. Light could be simulated to sweep across her decks, revealing shadows that no human eye had ever seen. For the first time, we could see the Titanic not as fragments, but as a complete body, both magnificent and broken. What the data whispered, the researchers began their analysis, expecting only structural insights. But soon, strange details emerged. The scans showed distortions and ruptures in places that contradicted long-accepted theories. What had been believed for decades, that a single, massive gash doomed the ship, no longer matched the evidence. Instead, the new model revealed a chain of small, clean punctures, each one isolated but devastatingly aligned. They were spaced along the starboard side, tiny ruptures caused by pressure and impact rather than one violent tear. It was the forensic proof of a theory once dismissed: the Titanic had not been destroyed by one wound, but by many, a death by 1,000 cuts. This revelation alone began to reshape the historical record, but there was more. As the data was studied further, technicians noticed machinery still locked in position, levers frozen mid-motion, valves still open as though tended by invisible hands. One of those valves, found deep inside the stern section, appeared to have been left fully open, proof that steam was still being fed to the generators even as the ship tore apart. To historians, this single detail meant everything. It confirmed what survivors had always claimed, but few believed: the Titanic's lights had stayed on until the very end. In those final minutes, as chaos and freezing water swallowed the decks, the ship still glowed in the darkness. And if steam was still flowing, that meant men were still down there working. The silent engineers. It was the engineers who had kept the heart of the ship beating. Men who never fled, never stopped, never saw the dawn. While passengers screamed above, they stayed below, surrounded by thunder and heat and water that rose faster with each second. They knew what was coming. They knew they would die. Yet they kept the power running so others could see their way to safety. For over a century, their sacrifice had been half believed, half forgotten, a legend of loyalty softened by myth. But now, the data had confirmed it. The open steam valve was their final signature, written not in ink, but in machinery. The new scan had done something that no historian, no survivor, no filmmaker ever could. It had given voice to the dead. The mission had achieved far more than technology promised. It had resurrected truth, in steel, in silence, in digital light. But the story of the Titanic was not finished. Because when the scans revealed the bow in haunting detail, intact, proud, and timeless, they also showed something darker in the stern, steel torn like paper, decks crushed together, chaos frozen in time. The wreck was collapsing faster than anyone had feared. And what the 3D model revealed next would prove that this scan might be our last chance to see the Titanic as she truly is, before the sea finally takes her forever. The truth the scan revealed when the data from the 2022 expedition was finally processed. The digital twin of the Titanic revealed more than just her image. It exposed her truth. For over a century, the story of the ship's sinking had been told and retold in books, documentaries, and classrooms. A single iceberg had ripped open her side, they said. The gash was massive, the wound fatal, the disaster inevitable. But now, for the first time, science was looking at the wreck with precision that no human diver had ever achieved. And what it found turned that story on its head. The iceberg's true strike. As forensic analysts pored over the new 3D model, they began tracing the scars along the Titanic's starboard side, the side that had faced the iceberg that night in 1912. The conventional image had always been of a single, jagged tear stretching down the hull like a knife wound through metal. But the scans told a different story. Instead of one long rupture, there were 6 smaller punctures, each about the size of a notebook. Clean, narrow openings where the hull plating had been forced apart just enough for seawater to burst through under immense pressure. Individually, these punctures seemed trivial. Collectively, they were fatal. They lined up perfectly, with 6 of the Titanic's watertight compartments, cutting into each one like a series of surgical incisions. The iceberg hadn't sliced her open, it had perforated her, spreading the damage across critical sections of the hull. This was the first hard evidence of what historians once called death by 1,000 cuts. Each compartment began to flood, one after another, in a chain reaction that no human hand could stop. The failure of the unsinkable design. When Titanic was built, she was hailed as the pinnacle of safety. Her lower decks were divided into 16 watertight compartments. The principle was simple: even if 4 flooded, the others would remain sealed and buoyant. On paper, it made her indestructible. But no one had accounted for what would happen if 6 compartments were compromised at once. The scans revealed how, as the first compartments filled, the ship's bow sank lower, tilting the vessel forward. The watertight bulkheads, meant to hold the water in place, did not extend high enough to the upper decks. Once the water reached their tops, it spilled over like a row of overflowing cups, cascading from one section to the next. This was the moment the ship's own safety system turned against her. The very walls that were supposed to keep her afloat became the pathways that pulled her down. It was not brute destruction that killed the Titanic. It was physics. A slow, merciless surrender to balance, pressure, and gravity. The scans even captured the exact points where her steel began to deform. The rivets pushed out by pressure, the plating bent inward where water punched through with the force of tons per second. Each flaw, each imperfection, told the same story. The ship that was never supposed to sink was undone, not by one failure, but by many, each one invisible until it was too late. Light in the darkness, among the hundreds of findings from the 3D model, one discovery struck the team with quiet reverence. In the deepest part of the stern, amid collapsed decks and mangled beams, a steam valve stood open. To most, it would have looked like a small, insignificant detail, another piece of machinery frozen in time. But to Titanic historians it meant something profound. This valve was part of the system that fed steam to the ship's dynamos, the generators that powered her lights. If it was open, that meant one thing. Steam had still been flowing even as the ship broke apart. The implication was chilling. It proved that the ship's engineers, deep below the decks, surrounded by heat, noise, and flooding water, had stayed at their posts until the very end. For years, survivors had spoken of how the Titanic's lights had remained on as she sank, illuminating the decks as lifeboats were lowered into the icy Black Sea. Skeptics called it exaggeration or grief, distorted memory. But the wreck itself had now confirmed their words. The engineers had kept the power flowing long after escape was impossible. They had given the passengers above a few more minutes of light, a few more moments of order, before darkness took everything. In those final minutes, the Titanic was still alive because of them. Men whose names were barely remembered had bought time for hundreds to reach safety, at the cost of their own lives. The ship's final agony, the 3D scans, didn't just confirm the physical cause of the sinking. They revealed how violent the ship's final moments truly were. As the bow sank beneath the surface, the stern was lifted high into the air, nearly vertical. At that angle, the ship's spine could no longer bear the strain. The steel beams at midsection, already weakened by cold and pressure, began to twist and snap. The model showed the exact point of failure just behind the grand staircase, near the third funnel. There, the decks folded under their own weight until the hull finally split in two. Eyewitnesses had spoken of a terrible sound, a roar like thunder mixed with sharp cracks like gunfire. The scans confirmed what they heard: metal breaking apart in sequence, bulkheads collapsing one after another as the ship's body tore itself apart. When the stern section fell back into the ocean, the force of the impact created new ruptures. Cabins that had once held families and crew members crumpled like paper. Everything inside, furniture, luggage, even people, was pulverized or thrown free into the freezing water. The digital model showed this destruction in haunting detail. Decks once stacked neatly were now folded together, crushed through each other in layers. Ceilings were pushed into floors. Walls were gone. Steel was peeled back like petals of a dying flower. It was not graceful. It was chaos preserved in steel. What the scan proved: for over 100 years, humanity had viewed the Titanic as a cautionary tale of arrogance, a ship built in pride, destroyed by nature. But the truth the scans revealed was more nuanced and more human. The disaster wasn't just a story of ice and steel. It was a convergence of design, circumstance, and bravery, a moment where technology's limits were tested, and where ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of courage in the face of certain death. The 2022 digital scan didn't change the Titanic's legacy. It completed it. It showed us how small the damage truly was and how vast its consequences became. It showed us how every decision, every rivet, every sealed bulkhead played its part in the chain of fate, and it showed us that, even as the ship fell apart, there were lights still burning, proof that hope, however brief, outlived the steel. The world now had the clearest understanding of what happened that night. But as the data continued to be analyzed, one haunting realization emerged. The wreck was dying. Slowly, silently, the ocean was reclaiming what was left. And if something wasn't done soon, even this digital twin, this perfect resurrection, would become the only way future generations would ever see her again. The Titanic had one more story to tell, the story of her final decay and of the race to preserve her memory before she disappears forever. The wreck, the legacy, and the race against time. For more than 100 years, the Titanic has lain in darkness, a monument to ambition, loss, and the limits of human control. But now, for the first time, we can see her completely, not through fragments or grainy photographs, but in full. The 2022 3D digital scan revealed every deck, every fracture, every ghostly outline of her final hour, and what it showed was both magnificent and terrifying. A ship frozen in time. When the scan's digital reconstruction was unveiled, experts described the sensation as surreal. It was like standing before a time machine, one that had paused history at 12:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. There she was resting on the ocean floor 500 feet down. The bow, proud, solemn, instantly recognizable, still pierced the seabed, as though straining forward on her unfinished journey. The stern, meanwhile, was an explosion of chaos, a portrait of destruction so violent that even time had not been able to make sense of it. The scan revealed the Titanic's dual nature, half preserved, half annihilated. The bow looked almost peaceful, railings still curved along the deck, the anchors still sat in place. Even the bell was visible, encrusted with rusticles but unmistakable. The form of the ship remained clear, almost elegant. Then the camera turned to the stern, and peace vanished. There, steel was twisted into spirals. Decks had folded into one another like crushed pages. Floors had collapsed through ceilings. In the tangle of beams and bulkheads, you could still trace the outlines of rooms that once held laughter, conversation, and hope. Now, they were empty caverns of corrosion. The contrast was devastating, beauty and ruin side by side, the echoes that endured. But the scan didn't only capture destruction, it also uncovered what had somehow endured. A ventilator fan, still upright, its blades frozen in place. A lifeboat winch, its gears still intact, silently locked in the same position they held the night the last boats were lowered. The skeletal frame of the wireless room skylight, marking where desperate telegraphs had been sent into the night. CQD sauce messages that crackled across the ocean until silence claimed them. Even the teak margins of the deck could still be traced, proof of craftsmanship that had outlasted empires. The teak had resisted decay better than steel, its grain visible beneath layers of silt. The pine boards that once filled the gaps were long gone, but the rivet lines remained, precise and deliberate, a map of human labor preserved by pressure and cold.